Hello. So today I'm going to talk about chapter 5 of Developments in French Politics. This chapter goes into the National Rally Party, which eventually becomes the Rassemblement National Party, which is the far-right party in French politics, which of course has become much more popular and much more powerful in French elections recently. It goes into how the old party that was first made under Jean-Marie Le Pen was a different party than what it is now, as it was transformed under his daughter, Marine Le Pen. This book only goes up into 2021, so it doesn't cover the fact that afterwards there is this current case with Marine Le Pen being ineligible to run, but she might appeal this case. We'll see within the next year if something happens there. But if not, as of this moment, Jordan Bardella, he is the current leader of the National Rally Party. But either way, from this whole chapter, we have seen that this same process of Rassemblement National has only increased in its popularity from when this book is talking about even up to now, as the party remains one of the most deciding voices in French politics, in elections especially. So as radicalism becomes an ever-increasing presence in French politics, we must obtain a new lens regarding the term radical and the metrics by which we consider our politics as becoming more radical, which is to say, further to one side of the political aisle in general, not just the left side, as sometimes we associate that term with. So Rassemblement National was created by Jean-Marie Le Pen as this far-right substitute for the right-wing voters that felt that the Les Républicains party, which was before called the UMP party, was not a party that they felt understood their concerns, especially regarding cultural erosion and immigration, to which Jean-Marie's party was able to fulfill these concerns. Once Marine Le Pen took over in 2011, she interestingly continued this approach that her father had in instituting this newer wave of radical politics within an already established radical party, in that she opted for the party to be more inclusive of non-ethnic French identities, as Jean-Marie's was based on especially, including having more French people of color, taking up laïcité, which is the principle of church and state remaining separate in French politics and government, as a way of positioning Rassemblement National as a more inclusive of the decreasing religious cohorts of French citizens. It's almost as if the radical Rassemblement National underwent another radical transformation that was somewhat normalized to a certain extent, which in a way, since a party is considered radical, probably the most radical thing it can do is become normal in a way. So Le Pen did this by being able to position the Muslim populations as going against the French Republican principle of laïcité due to the use of headscarves for women in public and other forms of public religious worship that she described as even as somewhat invasive, as somewhat similar to the old Nazi occupational position that she described some Muslims as. This is a similar trend that we have witnessed in the American Trump rhetoric, in the American context, where far-right ideologies like pushing back on immigration, it no longer just prides itself on the Anglo-Saxon, Christian, heteronormative identity as before, but instead that Trump and Le Pen have similarly opened up their respective ideological stances and their parties as fighting for the national identity, which includes people of color, Jews, and even those from the LGBT community, with some caveats regarding trans people. So rather than stick to the old guard conservatism of the ethnic identity policy of French nationality, that which the late Jean-Marie Le Pen propelled when he was party leader, Marine Le Pen has been able to rebrand far-right French politics as not so exclusive nor fringe through the de-diabolisation campaign she has taken credit for following her father's departure from the leadership. Interestingly, this also came around the time when David Cameron in the United Kingdom was trying to make the Conservative Party be rid of its nasty party status that many associated with a similar perspective towards that party as many in France consider the exclusive and almost dangerous far-right Rassemblement National. So we must recognize that across other countries, far-right policies no longer play by the traditional roles of race and patriarchal concepts as has been commonly known in history, but that the very movements that had aimed to go against those exclusionary and oppressive politics that were predominantly right-wing policies, so this was movements in trying to provide more representation for voices of color and trying to give same-sex couples equal legal treatments in marriage and adoption rights, this has not necessarily resulted in the death of right-wing political ideologies, but instead those right-wing political parties and ideologies have tailored themselves to fit the goals of these recently included peoples. And it shows that something like if you are an immigrant from West Africa living in France, or you're a Latino in Texas, you can still be a part of the right-wing spectrum of those politics in that country because you in some way share a commonality with the national identity that the right wing or the right side of politics continues to fight for, i.e. laïcité's values against the growing population that carries Islamic values in France, or Latino Americans who come from legal migration descent, who go against those who they say didn't migrate here the right way, just illegally in general. There is also another important caveat worth noting in this inclusive far-right ideology rebranding, in that the old guard of the far-right is not necessarily dying away, but might be in a position of a further type of left-behindedness, as we have seen in many countries, where this is something that can be manifested either in harmony with the inclusive growth of their respective parties, and that they just want to immerse themselves with this growing population within their original ideology, or this could lead to a further assertion of the original Anglo-Saxon Christian or other identifying factors of the traditional far right in many Western countries. So due to the endless possibilities of community building and action that can take place, especially through online technologies that have continued to connect the world, I wouldn't say that we should disregard this possibility of a further assertion in the original far-right politics as a totally discardable idea. There's also much to point out in how the efforts to normalize far-right ideology also provides a self-imploding possibility. So now that an increase in support for immigration control has become popular in countries like the United States and France in the recent years, thanks in part to the resounding success of this rhetoric in those elections, what used to be far-right ideologies have now become mainstream in some respects, though of course not to the same extent, but nonetheless now more prevalent and more sought for across many populations as it did about 10 or even 15 years ago. National politics have never reached an answer that all can agree on. Some have always believed something doesn't go far enough, or some believe it goes too far. So as soon as one policy becomes the status quo, a new space of concern almost always erupts from the results of policy. For example, we can think of the welfare state establishments across the West that were seen as necessary by the mid-20th century, but a sentiment of it being too much came to form, and it not being enough also came to form simultaneously and just grew in their powers over time. So this then brings to question, if we do institute the policies of these former further right, but now growingly mainstream policies on immigration reform, what then might form as a result of this policy in action and its likely insufficient response to this crisis that could be met with a possibly even further exclusionary approach and ridding a country like France of those who don't speak French fluently, or in the US of ridding itself of those who find certain policies regarding patriotism and American identity as anti-American. Now, this isn't to provide anxiety and foresee this type of dangerous future necessarily, but this argument is to point out that from the adoption of new policies comes its own backlash, as we almost historically see this happen. And for something like immigration and its implicit ties to cultural preservation, there is much room for others to seek out an issue on this topic, as is the nature of just political behavior, especially as the left behind sentiment is becoming an increasingly prominent political phenomenon in an age of technological democratization and the ability to connect peoples more and more than ever we have ever seen before. So, as far-right ideologies have been able to garner support amongst women and LGBT populations in recent years, it's worth noting what the author pointed out in the Le Pen strategy regarding how French and Western values are posited as being threatened by the Muslim world. So discourse regarding how women and people in the LGBT community feel most unsafe in neighborhoods of Muslim populations through the framing of Islam's comparatively less open approach towards LGBT communities than other religions, as well as the idea of how male chauvinism exists within Muslim culture, as Le Pen has pointed out in some of her rhetoric. This has made me realize just how fluid the concepts of progressive politics, as we have commonly come to know them as, like LGBT and women's equals rights, how truly they are in terms of being progressive, and how they can be positioned as being on two opposite ends of the spectrum in moments like now. Muslims, women, and people of the LGBT community have tended to be boxed in under the minority category in American society, and I believe it's quite similar in French society, especially given the similar histories of social power that the two countries share. So we have tended to see this whole group as monolithic in their policies for general progressive and left-wing politics, especially since the turn of the century. But what we are witnessing now is a rupture in this monolithic group, which is, in a way, never was truly monolithic to begin with, when in fact their policies were just under the general category of being contradictory to the status quo in social policy. So in the aftermath of the October 7th attack in Israel by Hamas and Israel's ensuing war afterwards, there was a popular movement I observed in the United States of LGBT for Gazans. This was actually quite common also in Spain when I was living there at the time, and other parts within the West. And it was a complex issue to support, considering Israel was the only country in the region to have legalized gay marriage, and in some countries that aim to support Palestine's independence, like Saudi Arabia, being gay is and still remains punishable by death. And Palestine does not exactly show itself in total disagreement with these kinds of policies. Le Pen used this concept of social liberalism in supporting these historically marginalized groups in Western society, like women and the people from the LGBT community. This is something that the Dutch Geert Wilders employed as a way of attracting certain growing segments of the diversifying Dutch public to align with right-wing Dutch politics, as it opposes itself to Muslims on the basis of cultural and religious differences. Le Pen has carried out this same approach in the French context. Trump has also proved himself no socially traditional character in his unclear opposition to abortion and embrace of the LGBT community to his side of the political aisle. It's not so much now that because one is a part of the umbrella term minority, they will by and large vote for the left-wing progressive politics, but because, again, as I kind of take issue with the word progressive, being supportive of gay rights is not as progressive of a stance as it was before, because it is now relatively mainstream, especially in the West. And thus, identifying with one of these groups and aligning oneself with progressive politics is not as interconnected as it once was, when being gay was still a legally ostracizing issue, for example, in the US, when it wasn't until about 50-ish years ago that it was no longer considered being a mental illness. We are now seeing progressivism and conservatism turn on its head as bodies like the far-right Rassemblement position laïcité as this new form of French conservatism, and that Muslims bringing religion to the French public is now the new infiltration of the homeland that defends the separation of church from state, as well as the French state's perceived protection of the rights of women and LGBT groups that Le Pen has framed as antithetical to Muslim culture. Progressivism, in this case, is framed as going against the national status quo by French conservatism and far-right politics. But then again, progressivism has had a history of being framed by conservatives as infiltrating national values and nations as a whole, and is nothing truly outlandish, and is thus this type of boy who cried wolf dilemma, and not knowing when to actually take the concerns of conservatives seriously. Regardless of how effective this argument is, it's proving itself an appealing reason for French people to vote right-wing for the sake of preserving the state, as is from the potential threats Islam has towards women's rights and other culturally marginalized groups, as Le Pen and the French far right has framed this issue. Thank you for watching this video, and for some of you who are just new to my channel, just to keep you guys updated on what this channel is for, it's really just for me to express these types of thoughts I am forming about what I am reading in these books. I did about UK politics, now about French politics. It's just for me to express what I am trying to categorize as a general, trying to be as impartial stance on how I perceive the political changes we see in these countries, and in general the global scale. Because I am just trying to essentially spitball here, speak out loud with some structure from a screen that I am reading, I also understand that I don't know everything, and you might find me 110% wrong. And in that case, I would actually like to hear what you guys think about this. You can comment, you can say what you want. I honestly am just happy to know that there is engagement in general on this page alone. So I want to thank you guys for that, but thank you again for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.